Good morning and welcome everyone. So we are here for the session by Dr. Ogunusi, and he will speak to us about participatory action research with regard to youth work and peace. So over to you.
Thank you. So good morning.
Good morning.
Good morning. Where are our energy levels at? If you're feeling really good, give me a thumbs up. If you're so, thumbs in the middle. All right, a lot of energy in the room, which is brilliant. Interesting dispersal, I have to say. We've got a dense population over here and not so dense over there. Okay, so I'm a researcher, youth worker, peace educator, advocator, lecturer, community development worker. The thing that all of my roles have in common is that I'm committed to this idea of challenging violence and promoting peace. So today, really, I want to reiterate the idea that it's not enough for us just to be in the world or to work in the world or to study the world. That actually we have a responsibility to act, to create a more humane and a more just society. And I hope that by demonstrating some of the theory and practice that came from my participatory action research, we can share some ideas today that can help us to do that. I've got quite a lot to get through. I always get far too overexcited when it comes to these things. I've probably got more material than is needed. But as a consequence, what I'm going to do is I'm going to read from my notes as we go through some slides, just to try and keep what I say succinct. There'll be opportunities for you to get involved in some activities. And then what I'm hoping is that we'll have time at the end for questions. Now you've got flip chart paper and pens. So as we move through, if anything comes into your head, if you've got any questions, if you've got some ideas, if you react to anything that I say, write them down so we can collect them at the end. Does that sound okay? Yeah? All right, let's get started. So what is PAR? You can see on this slide that I've used the term researcher to be interchangeable with that of youth worker. And I thought that was really pertinent in the context of this conference, because there are a lot of ideas. I'd actually suggest that most of the ideas around PAR are congruent with youth work, especially that type of youth work that's interested in critical education, empowerment, and social change. And I really want to emphasize before we get into these slides that you don't have to be an academic to get involved in PAR. Yeah? I was being a researcher long before I started my formal studies. I was routinely observing and questioning the reality around us. I was describing the social reality lived by young people. I was attentive to young people's own expressions and experiences, as well as building relationships with young people in situations that were often quite challenging. Now, all of these skills are essential to PAR, and I'd actually suggest that they're things that we do really well as youth workers. What do you think? Would you agree?
Yeah.
So I've always been influenced by the ideas of Freire, of his work in Brazil. But for me, how Freire's principles translates into practice really stood out in terms of the research that I carried out with young people back in 2020 using PV, which is short for photo voice. Has anybody used photo voice or come across that term before? Okay. So really, it is what it says on the tin, right? It's about taking photographs or opening spaces for marginalized communities to use their photographs and words to create local change. And importantly, in this process, the silence are not just incidental to the curiosity of the researcher, but they are the masters of inquiry into the underlying causes of the events in their work. So we situate participants in PAR and in photo voice as being central to what it is we're interested in. And As well, I'd ask you to pay attention to this, to promote critical dialogue, because I'd argue that that's something that's actually slipped in photo voice if we go to the literature. So what is critical dialogue? So in this one slide, I've tried to summarize much of the thinking of Freire, right? Hopefully it will be useful. So when it comes to PV, it aims for the idea that, dialogue is structured around the idea that we have a natural ability to reflect and act in the world and on the world in order to transform it. That's what we see on the left, praxis. However, as you know, we live in a social reality that is oppressive, right? And we internalize this oppression. And we internalize it in ways that are known to us and unknown to us. Consequently, our ability to transform the world is diminished. It's systematically eroded, resulting in different levels of consciousness that we see on the right of this screen, that go all the way from being non-critical to self-determined. Now, in its purest form, photo voice is rooted in dialogue, premised by the idea that the more we recognize our natural ability and agency to challenge oppression using dialogue, the more likely we are to harness those spaces between the actual and the potential state of the world in ways that are deliberate, transformative, and humanizing. This is a powerful idea, right? Okay, and I think it has a lot to offer when we think about challenging the violence of oppression and advancing peace. So the first thing that I'd like you to do is to just look at some of these different types of consciousness. And I'd like you to take a minute and reflect individually on what these degrees of consciousness might mean for you when you think about issues of young people, peace and social justice, and your practice. For example, do you feel that change happens somewhere else? Do you think that change is determined at levels above you, where you feel you have little control? Do you find that you're quite reactive, or perhaps you focus on just one aspect of the struggle against oppression at a time, just to avoid feeling overwhelmed? Maybe your passion makes you emotive, and you have this righteous anger in your belly. Maybe you take positions and struggle to take people along with you on a journey. Or maybe you've reached a place where you have the scope and maybe the privilege to extend dialogue on a daily basis around you. So just take a minute and reflect. Where are you? I'm not suggesting either that you can only be in one of these places. You can occupy more than one at the same time. But thinking about your practice and thinking about some of these issues to do with young people and peace, thinking about social justice, where are you? You get a Zen-like state in the room. Okay. Now maybe talk to the person next to you in pairs. Where do you think you are in this dichotomy of practice and consciousness? Okay, so I heard some really interesting discussions. I didn't get to you guys at the back, but I'm sure you got into this. Did the activity make sense? Yeah, okay. I mean, just to be transparent, I find that I constantly jump between this and this, right? I find that there are things that happen that I respond to almost on a visceral level, right? It's quite emotive. And I feel, again, that I live in paradigms and traditions that aren't constructed for me, by me, or in my interest. And that has, you know, an emotive response. It's not always something that we can abstract and get cognitive about, right? But at the same time, my work, all of the work that I choose to do is invested in this, you know? So how did I integrate that idea of the duality and praxis of consciousness into research? So this is where we get to this idea of what I coined dialogic photo voice. There are a lot of projects out there doing photo voice. I'm not convinced that they appreciate the complexities of what we've just started to look at in that last slide. And for me, it's centered on dialogue as necessary and intentional to provide opportunities for young people to participate, make decisions, and take ownership, using their own language, knowledge, and power, both in the research, but also outside of the research. I first used this model as part of a project called Young People, Peace and Change. And the research, you know, I still find it surprising to say this. The research was the first of its kind to investigate how young people in England, and potentially the UK, if we start looking at what we mean to understand our understanding of peace. But it was the first project in England to ask young people how they understood peace. Yeah? If you go to the literature, you will find numerous articles, projects constructed around young people and violence. But there's something about peace, yeah? And we'll get to that later on. My project lasted just under 2.5 years. It involved 21 young people in 5 different groups in 5 different inner city settings, with each project lasting between 3 to 8 months. So you can see already, even when I start talking about 3 to 8 months, the length of time that it takes to actually commit to something like this. Yeah, we have to be invested in it. The stages of the research obviously are outlined on the slide. 3 of the projects involved youth workers as gatekeepers. So youth workers were the people who granted me access to groups of young people. 2 of the projects took place in youth and community centres. And I guess just to give you a little bit of the context, that those centres were situated in areas where there was high unemployment, job insecurity, low salaries, poor health, high mortality rates, high teenage conception and child poverty rates, low adult literacy and numeracy. And both of the youth centres that the project took place in reported instances, and I witnessed instances of violence between young people in the community that had spilt into the youth centres and impacted the work that was taking place in those youth centres. The next 2 slides will sort of give you a bit of detail in terms of what do these boxes actually mean. So we started off with informal group activities that just introduce peace. And the idea here really, as the coordinator, was that I was looking for and hoping that young people would recognize generative words, right? Have you come across this term before? So it's this idea that there are certain words that we express in a way that are obviously loaded with meaning. Yeah, so it's looking at how young people in their own language were talking about peace in ways that were loaded with meaning. I made sure that the activities were responsive and flexible enough to build on what young people introduced at the time, that these activities critically engaged or allowed young people to critically engage with their own knowledge, experience, and their needs, and what this might mean for their interests and concerns regarding peace. And again, I have to say that, you know, my background in youth work really helped in terms of managing some of the dynamics and designing some of the activities for this. Then it was about camera time. So we looked at the ethics, the consent, issues that are involved in taking photographs, safety, even insofar as, you know, there were certain areas where young people would become a target if they were seen to be walking around with a camera, you know, so these are a lift issues of risk and safety. We spoke about camera use. Obviously, a lot of it now is just phones and click, but, you know, there are different ways to understand taking pictures and using cameras and the results that come from how we frame pictures. And then young people were given up to 2 weeks. This was negotiated with them, 2 weeks to document their representations of peace. And I bought cameras, and I bought cameras on the understanding that they might get lost, they might get stolen, I might not see them again. That was factored in to the project. And they were robust. These things had rubber around them. You could throw them on the floor, you could drop them in the bath. Yes, they were made to last. And the reason that I said wording reality here is that gave young people an opportunity to word what they see and experience through their own eyes, right? Using photographs. So codifications of peace. What I mean there is those photographs were then brought into the research to specifically communicate how young people operationalize peace for themselves. Not what ideas I might have of peace or what ideas are in the literature around peace, what peace meant specifically to those young people. And the photographs were, I call them levelers, right? They were levelers in terms of power. They challenged the myth of their own ignorance. Yeah, they put young people in a position where they could show something that was tangible. You couldn't argue with their interpretation of their lived experience. Yeah, so it started to position them as being validated in this co-production of knowledge. The photographs also helped structure how young people articulated their knowledge. Yeah, because sometimes they didn't necessarily have the immediate language to express some of the ideas behind their pictures, but the image itself supported them in their process in being able to share that. And they became overtly attached to their photographs. Now, to me, that was really beneficial because it demonstrated that in some way, young people were enjoying the process. They felt that they were getting something from the process. And obviously, it offered them something to take away from the research. So at any point, they could leave the research, but they would still have their photographs, right? Also encourage participation and retention, help build relationships and trust. And the reason that I say that is because, once again, when we're talking about photographs, there's a guy called Harper who talks about breaking the frame, right? And it's this idea that when we're processing images, we use a different part of our brain. Yes, so we engage with visual information in a different way to we do written information or stuff that we hear. So it encouraged the freeness about their experiences. They actually went to places and went to explanations about their photography that they didn't expect themselves. So this is what we call breaking the frame. It took them to places where they really understood their own knowledge and the way that they saw peace in the world. Is this making sense? Yeah. So then next, we went through a process of photo elicitation. And this was using a schedule of questions to help young people re-see, reread, and re-know. So this was revisiting the photos and revisiting the meaning that they gave to those photos, both individually and in groups, which I think is important because you all know we get a different discussion with somebody when it's one-to-one, right, than we do when it's in a group. So I thought it's important to offer both spaces. And the schedule purposefully moved from just simply researching the knowledge of young people towards positioning young people as potential agents of change. So the schedule itself moved through a particular process that you'll experience in a minute. The questions were open, clear, accessible. So I got all the questions proofed by young people first. Does this stuff make sense? Would you be able to answer these questions? And they were repeated. So I used the same questions in interview. We used the same questions over and over again in the focus groups so that we had that familiarity, that continuity. They knew what was coming. It was transparent. Sometimes it was like, well, nothing's changed. I'm still in the same place as I was when we spoke about it before. But quite often, each time we revisited it, it exposed something different, exposed something new. We then moved from the questions and the groups to action planning and handover. And this is where we move from describing, exploring these pictures to, okay, so potentially what are we going to do about some of this stuff? And this is where young people started to understand their knowledge of peace as praxis. Do you remember that slide where I was saying we moved between reflecting on the world to actually taking action based on our knowledge of the world, right? So this is where young people move towards praxis. And they developed aims, they identified audiences, their roles, resources, support. And then this, when I say handover, that's because it had to be negotiated with a trusted gatekeeper. And then the process ended with public engagement. So this is what I call, and Freire calls, action in knowledge, right? So this is where they acted in their own knowledge to speak back, speak out, and extend dialogue. So they shared representations, knowledge, experiences of peace, including what peace meant to them, why it was important, how it existed in their everyday life. And the photos, again, offered an authentic medium for communicating publicly. So young people who weren't comfortable or weren't used to having experiences of standing up in front of others, you know, they found that sometimes they literally almost hid behind a photograph to start with, but then made themselves available for questioning. And you could see the body language change, their movement change, they put themselves to the fore. They involve youth-led activities that, again, importantly, weren't just about audiences turning up and young people standing there and then being wheeled off stage and everybody clapping and that was the end of it. The young people wanted to provoke and encourage audiences to question their own assumptions about peace and life. They asked audiences, and these audiences were comprised of their, I've used the word peers because not just their friends. Sometimes they were in communities where there were other young people in those communities and they spoke to young people outside of their own networks. So they engaged with audiences of peers, families, their families, but they were also interested in bringing families who were in conflict, where they lived together as part of this work, youth workers, teachers, senior youth work managers, to consider what actions they might take for peace at a local level. And some of the sort of indications of what they were suggesting to have peace mentors in youth clubs, accessible spaces that were designed and orientated around the language of peace rather than conflict and violence. And they were concerned about community responses to some of the barriers to peace that they experienced in their everyday life. Right, so just to get an idea of the type of questions that can shift us from simply describing something to explaining something to finding positionality and then potentially looking at how we might act around it. I'd like you to find a picture on your phone, or if you haven't got a phone and you're not comfortable doing that, quickly draw something, yeah, even if it's just a stick person that represents peace to you, yeah. I'd then like you to, I think we might do this on tables if you'd like to join another table. Then I want you to share those pictures with each other, yeah, just to get an idea of how each of us are thinking about peace. And then maybe one of you volunteer or you decide which image you're going to use to go through this schedule. Yeah. So you ask these questions. How does this image represent peace? How does this relate to you? If you use this photo to send a message to inform or educate others about peace, what would your message be? And what can we do to make this happen? Yeah. And jot down some stuff on the flip charts as well. You've got 15 minutes to think about this and get into this. And I'll just float around different tables at different times to get a sense of where you want to be. Is everybody clear what it is I'm asking you to do? Yeah. Yeah? Okay. All right, you wonderful people. You know what, I was actually reluctant to interrupt there because some of the discussion that was happening on the table, I actually felt was quite important. Would you like just to feedback some, not even necessarily in the order of these questions, but what were some of the things that you discussed as you went through that schedule?
Yeah. Should we start? Do you want to show the image first? That might be a bit small. Just we all have some really nice images.
Okay.
One was a dragonfly on the surface of the water.
Okay. So sorry, say that again.
Sorry.
It was a dragonfly. I filmed in slow motion a dragonfly on just above the surface of water, watching flies. I realised at some point I was watching this dragonfly. The dragonfly was watching.
Right. Okay.
It was just a quiet moment.
Okay.
In nature.
interesting. It's a quiet moment with a predator, right?
Well,
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
that was the point. So we were
Yeah.
all watching the joke with me.
Yeah,
We
yeah.
were all watching each other, and nobody got hurt.
Yeah.
The fly, because I was waiting for this dragonfly to hunt, and I was going to try and film it in
Yeah.
slow motion, but it just stayed there watching.
But I think that almost talks to a point that you guys were making about whose peace.
Yeah.
Yeah. If we're talking about peace as being a place or a space or an idea, from what perspective or through what lens are we looking at that? So that's quite interesting. What else did you say?
Well, there were various. People talked about meditating, and we ended up in a conversation about meditating. There were pictures of animals, mostly about nature.
Okay.
Really.
Okay.
That's the
Talked
theme.
about how peace can be a perspective thing, and it can come from within. How you could be maybe in a war-torn area, or I've been to places where people have nothing, but they're very peaceful and very happy, and how they find a way to find it within themselves, not externally.
Okay.
But external
Okay.
peace is important too.
Okay. So, I mean, there's something in what you're saying that resonates with the findings from my research, which we'll get to, which is this thing about self-initiated peace. Yeah, that somehow we're looking at something in self to initiate peace for us. But you had your thing was nature, sort of, and I guess therefore, how do we take responsibility to find peace in nature, right? So it's something driven by us. Where were you guys at? Give us a bit of a summary in terms of where you went.
No, first the conversation was much of the same. Our news was a picture of a creek. And so our conversation started from there, and it's the kind of sprouted out into conversations about reparations, about what justice means, and how a lot of these things, like you just mentioned, starts with self and a decision to make peaceful decisions and to create an environment of peace. As I was sitting here and thinking, because today is a very emotional day, but I was thinking about, I find a lot of my inspiration in nature because I believe a lot in biomimicry. I think nature teaches us a lot of what we need to know and how we need to operate.
Yeah. Well, we are nature, right?
We are nature.
So even that distinction between nature is out there and us over here is
exactly. And I think we've lost a lot of that in the way we do politics and sociology and economics. We forget that everything we need to know is in front of us, and we are part of that. And we can't separate ourselves. So peace is a possibility. It is always a possibility. It is always a presence. It is always a present. And so I think that's what our conversation was about healing, about rest and radical rest, and rest that is not founded within colonization of any form.
Okay. Tell me about that. What's radical rest?
Radical rest is about, I think, making the decision, and this is just me because this is not from everyone. I think radical rest is about making the decision that you don't always have to be on the grind, doing things to prove yourself within a system that was not created for you and without you. I think that's what that.
And you're talking to something that really came out in the subtext of the findings with young people as well, but you've articulated it in a way to demonstrate that you're conscious of it. They were unconscious about this, which is why I call it a subtext, and we'll come to that. Hopefully it will resonate when we get there with what you've just said. Okay, thank you for that. So the findings actually demonstrated that, I'll just find where I am. The findings demonstrated the importance of dialogue for young people. So they expressed this in sort of four main themes, really. The first theme was non-deficit peace, which is this idea that we can't just simply understand peace as being anti-violencing or non-violencing or an antidote to violence. There's more to peace than that. And as you sort of started to explore there, this idea of peace isn't self-explanatory. Peace is situated and contextualized in the praxis. So both, and again, you really spoke to this about both being and becoming in everyday life. And I guess maybe some of that stuff around mindfulness as well. There's something about being as well as change. So what do we need to hold on to and retain in terms of peace? What do we not need to do in terms of peace? There's also this idea that peace was a generative word. So the more young people spoke about peace, the more they found they understood about peace. And that even went to sort of this meta cognition about how they knew what they knew about peace, where they then started questioning, you know, how they'd been socialized or introduced into peace, and why potentially sometimes for some of them it was just something that was not immediate. The first impressions of these first impressions of peace also went on to inform how they understood what I've called PATs. So these are these peace affirming tactics in everyday life that were both deliberate and unconscious. So interestingly enough, both groups have sort of picked up on the first thing, which is about how young people were involved in self-initiated peace, how they self-regulated peace for themselves in their lives. And that was on a personal level, and it really was about their choices and the routines that they made. But that subtext that I referred to a minute ago was underneath that. There was this clear message that they were dealing with this dichotomy of calm on one hand and stress on the other. And they were almost crying out for respite. They were finding all these different ways to try and create space or hold on to space or make space where they could be away from. But they never questioned why they needed to be away from. Yeah, does that make sense?
Yep.
So that's why I like that idea of radical peace, yeah, finding that, making that decision to be away from something that's explicitly conscious. What else? In terms of these peace affirming tactics, they spoke about how they'd learned peace and were learning peace in their relationships with other people. Who do you think young people identified as being their main teachers for peace?
Parents.
Parents. Okay.
Or parents. Or
Okay.
teachers.
Most times when I deal with young people, it's a elder in the community. It's some Rastafarian, somebody who communicates with them, some coach, somebody like that.
Okay.
Somebody who takes that time to engage them that way.
Okay.
So it's
so interesting. So they did identify parents, but if we break that down more, mums.
Yeah.
Mothers, right? And most of all, it was interesting. Remember, we're talking about peace, but they identified how their mothers dealt with conflict as being the main way that they learned how to deal with peace. The young people actually spoke about the lack of elders and the lack of role models and the lack of adults in their community. They did identify some. So they identified youth workers, which I think is really, really important in the context of this conference. And they identified certain named teachers.
Yep.
Yeah, they had an issue with schooling in different degrees, but they identified certain named teachers. They also shared how they had these value-based aspirations for peace that revolved around issues of respect and being okay with difference. And interestingly enough, they also went on to articulate how they felt that if communities adopted these same values, then those communities could act for peace too. Yeah, so they recognized these interpersonal links and how those interpersonal links could translate into community-based links to act in solidarity. I continue to use this model, develop and replicate this model of SOPEAL. Nobody's asked me what that stands for yet.
I was waiting for this.
All right, okay. So it's the sociology of peace in everyday life, right? So it's actually a new framework for looking at how we understand peace. And as you see, it's rooted in this idea that peace is deeply experiential, it's placed, it's non-reductionist, it's visceral, it's observable, temporal, routine, culturally significant, and it's rooted in that idea of praxis. So if you think back to the slide and the activities that you've done, it's this idea that it's rooted in the notion that we're not finished, our social reality aren't finished. Yeah, therefore peace is never finished. So if you come across narratives where somebody's trying to put peace in a box or ring fence peace in a particular way, I ask you to question that. Yeah, why is that being authored in that way, and what's the purpose? But the bit of the model that I want to focus on today is this move here, is this shift between peace limit situations and self-representation and advocacy tactics. So it's the last two bits. And the reason I want to do that is because that's where this notion of critical consciousness really came to the fore, where we can sort of see the impact of this dialogic approach. Any questions about that before we move on? Because I know there's quite a lot on there.
I have a question, but it's not. Oh wait.
Yeah? Do you want to write it down on the paper?
Oh wait.
So you don't lose it?
Yeah, yeah.
Okay, so let's talk about peace limit situations. So peace limit situations were about how young people problem pose peace in the practice of everyday life, in the connections and deep-rooted contradictions between social systems and people, exposing further contradictions of direct, structural, and cultural violence. And as part of that process, it meant that young people came face to face with their own oppression, right? So the example that you see on the slide is Nelson Mandela, Martin Luther. You hear about them, but you weren't there. We don't have a Nelson Mandela or Martin Luther in our generation. There's no one that's speaking up for us, right? Now, the inference there is that peace isn't something that's necessarily immediate. And again, they don't necessarily feel, a lot of these young people didn't necessarily feel that there were those role models out there that were actually demonstrating peace in their communities. So some examples of peace limit situations. Young people problem posed their lack of peace knowledge, and they attributed their lack of peace knowledge to the fact that they felt that they didn't have a lot of experience living peace. So again, it didn't feel like it was something that was direct, immediate in their world. They spoke about intersectionality. I know that you guys were talking about that on your table. They spoke about adultism, age, culture, religion, tradition, race, gender, militarism, gang risk. And they spoke about these things as being reciprocal. They felt like they were woven into the fabric of their communities, not just these abstract ideas, things that impacted their lives and the lives of people around them, and just went round in these cycles. They problem posed what they called closed individuals and systems. They understood that peace was in some ways synonymous with change and a conduit for change, and could be achieved through change. So the idea of closed individuals and systems they saw as automatically restricting peace. They also spoke about illusions of peace created by and exploited by adults. So, for example, they spoke about the politics of war, which they felt were disingenuous. They felt that in their experience of certain politicians, they felt that they weren't transparent, they were dishonest, they were self-serving. And they also identified that they felt that these were structures that were dominated by the global norm. So it moved from this local analysis to a wider analysis. But they also spoke more locally about situations and events that they felt were labeled as peaceful, to allow politicians and local services to almost abdicate their responsibilities. If we label something peaceful, then we don't need to take action. Does that make sense? Mm. And they also spoke about being othered and demonstrated this double consciousness of knowing what it's like to be othered, but also being able to extend and interpret how they understood the gaze of the other, what it looked like to be seen through an other gaze. So there's a lot there. And importantly, this process not only resulted in young people problem posing their reality, peeling back these what's described as normal around them, and move them towards wanting to act in their knowledge of peace to reach local communities and local decision makers, which is, core to the idea of participatory action research. But in addition, it actually resulted in young people identifying their own self-representation and advocacy tactics. They determined how they wanted to go about creating change for themselves and what tactics they were going to use. That's never been documented in photo voice before. These tactics focused on being self and socially conscious about how peace shapes us and how we shape peace in ways that are both deliberate, random, and opportunistic. Yeah, so that went all the way from smiling at somebody, yeah, through to having a conversation with somebody that you might not see again, and also how random encounters can create opportunities for peace. So being open to that. They spoke about the power of voice, to participate, send messages, challenge stereotypes, and disrupt adult and adultist notions of peace and young people. So, again, that was quite a politicized narrative in terms of the strength that young people recognized in the collective of their voice. And they're interested in seeking a community response. So as I said earlier on, not just standing in front of a community or talking at their community. They're interested in galvanizing a community response by which young people wanted audiences to do more than turn up. They wanted to open dialogue and seek change in their local communities. So as a result of the research, 3 of the 5 groups of young people planned, influenced, and/or led public engagement in front of audiences, as I said before, including senior staff and professionals. And you can see some of their ideas on here. I like this one because here, the young people themselves, if we go back to those levels of consciousness, they're actually starting to recognize that adults might not consciously engage with peace or be critically reflective or critical about peace. It's not just us that wants peace, it's other people, even though they might not consciously know it. I think that's a strong statement. Challenging stereotypes. I want them to know we've all suffered violence, but we still make a decision to deal with conflict non-violently and to help create change. How many times do we hear that narrative in the public domain? Yeah, in contrast to images of young people and violence. Yeah, and this reductionist narrative of young people and knife crime. Question life. I mean, we're talking about, fundamentals here, right? They wanted people in their local communities to question life, to start at those basics. You guys drew a tree when we did that last exercise. So that's going right to the roots of that tree, right? To question life itself. Ask what the definition of peace is and what makes them feel peaceful. And then again, speaks to what I've just said. Sometimes we actually need to take a step back and think about what the positive things are and what sort of things do promote peace. And sometimes those things aren't recorded in the press. We need to make sure that those things are spoken about. So it's just recognizing that the language of peace itself has power. It's like we were discussing earlier on, it's a counter narrative in itself, yeah? Okay. So I've got another activity for you guys. I want you to identify and discuss a barrier to peace. This might have even come from the last conversation that you had. I imagine that it will, right? And maybe if you can, a barrier that has some commonality for all of you in your group. That might be tricky. So if it's not all of you, maybe it's something that the majority of you in your group experience, a barrier to peace. And, as you would have already started to explore in our last activity, that can be on a personal level, it can be on a structural level. It could be culturally. You might be thinking in terms of individual, society, or the environment, or globally. Yeah. And then just jot down an idea of something small you can do individually. So this idea can be deliberate, random, opportunistic, that has the ability to spread and disrupt this barrier to peace in some way. Voice. How could you, as individuals and collectively, send messages that inform, protest, or educate around that barrier? And then seeking a community response. This is a far more complex question, but you know, maybe drawing from your own experiences, how can you invite wider audiences into dialogue? And it's this bit that's important. It's not just asking communities to turn up. It's getting communities engaged in dialogue. Yeah, we understand that distinction by now, right? To affect change. So I'm going to give you 15 minutes. I will give you 15 minutes this time. Right?
15 minutes,
I will
right?
give you 15
My
minutes this
internal
time.
clock is right.
I'm going to set my timer right now. So to give you warning, we've started.
Okay.
Okay, you marvelous people. Again, some really, really interesting discussion. If you can, if you're able, do you want to just summarize?
Okay, cool.
I think what I want to do is, rather than go through all three, what did you think would be impactful? Yeah, the young people thought all of these were impactful and disruptive. But what did you, out of these three responses, which one did you tend to focus on a little bit more? And what was some of the discussion that you were having around that?
Where's one start? Yeah.
Do you guys want to go first this time? You okay? Are you guys happy to go first this time? Because I've seen some finger pointing. Yeah.
Okay.
It doesn't matter.
Yes.
Okay.
If you're comfortable.
Okay. So we talked a lot about barriers for quite some time and
Okay.
looked around at everything, and then there was a minute left. So
Right. Fair enough.
but we a lot of that was covered in our discussions, but we did talk about ripple effects, the ripple. I talked about it actually. It was a real quick thing at the end, so I'm just going to quickly say, but you guys jump in around those small things that you can do as individuals. It gives you a bit of empowerment. You know that you're impacting change, but things like taking time to truly listen to why something is happening and go back, deconstruct something, find out what's going on, and don't be afraid to hear all of that, because actually that person might like to be heard. And if they like to be heard, maybe they're more willing to listen to someone else about something. So those small acts that you can do kind of incorporates an awful lot of what we were talking around the barriers. So would you say?
Yeah, we talked about that. Definitely. I think that's good. And what else did we say? I think we said trying to find like a tangible understanding of peace for young people, because like violence and or conflict can come with a reward at the end, but peace might not, or it's harder to see. And it's, I think, the young people, we're told that we need peace or we need to be friends, but we don't know why or like what we all gain from that. And it's a harder concept to understand because it's not physical, whereas violence is. Yeah.
See, I think potentially peace could be physical, but I really agree with your statement. Interestingly enough, it was that kind of remark from a young person that kind of set me on this journey in some ways back in 2006, where a young person said to me, but you know what, if you want young people to know about peace, you need to be able to tell them what's important about peace, right? And I think that talks to exactly what you're saying.
Yeah.
And again, one of the reasons why we're focusing on this idea of having a dialogic approach today is because, again, so many young people report that they find peace in the process of doing this stuff. Just having that space to reflect, just having that space to be heard, yeah? Just having that space to validate each other's experiences and move away from this deficit narrative of violence and conflict
You have to make with that. So you have to make it personal. Like you're saying, they found peace by doing it. That's bringing it to them and making it feel personal, so they now understand it and they're doing it. Like I mean, I'm a young person, and I think for a lot of us, we get told a lot of different things, that what's good for us, what's not good for us. But until we actually do it ourselves and it's a tangible physical thing, then we're like, oh, okay, maybe I'll listen now, or maybe I'll use this now because I actually think it's good for my life and I can see that it's good for my life and I want to do it. Whereas instead of just like hearing good things.
Yeah, great point.
Yeah,
great point. And I think you're talking to all of us, and you're probably talking to the converted. I think we're with you on that. But you know what you say is so important, because even in the literature, there's been a huge almost rebellion about this idea that peace is something that we can impose on other people. So even when we talk about these huge peace building strategies and this whole infrastructure that exists around, you know, the UN and international relations, you know, they're finding that when people go in with these peace indicators and trying to measure these criteria that's been determined somewhere else in the lives of these communities, they're actually coming back and saying that they feel less peaceful after the interventions than they did before the interventions. So you're right. If we are interested in this idea of peace, one, we have to at least find some positionality in it for ourselves, right? Which is what today's all about. But then it's about co-producing that with young people, if we're interested in young people. So thank you for that. It's important for us to hear.
Yeah, I think we're piggybacking on that. There's a little Bob Marley song, Could You Be Loved and Be Loved? And we look at the ripple, and I think I'll start in the middle, the mesos level, saying that this ripple of radical rest, radical re-engagement, radical reassessment, and radical redirection is something that we can do both as a inner jihad and also something external for ourselves. So inner jihad is the struggle for peace within, the struggle for internal justice, all that. But there's the external part, which I think we were discussing also, which is the high level, the systems, the oppressions, the heavy levels that are there on us. It is the seeking peace and wherever it is that, and that young people often are under the boot of all of that, whether in home, in community, or internationally, they're under the boot of that. And sometimes maybe the other thing that we can get them to do is to start seeing how they can find those moments of peace to stitch together, or moments of peace that they can find in and of themselves. And getting them to get to that point, that dialogic point, is something that's very important. Towards the end, we're also looking at from the other side, which is now trying to get them to see, or trying to get the system to see that, yeah, if you impose violence and impose oppression on people, at some point you're bringing it home to yourselves too, which we all know the system doesn't listen, but yeah, maybe at some point it
and you see, there's an argument that the system's designed to do that,
because
that then perpetuates the system. Because we need to remember as well, when we talk about violence, there are people who privilege and are privileged by violence, right? Obviously, our lens tends to be on those who were victimized and brutalized by violence, but there are those who are privileged. So even when I was talking about the young people problem posing the politics of war, that's what they were describing. The fact that actually there are people who are benefiting from these structures that exist. But this idea of stitching together spaces for peace, I think really encapsulates what young people had identified as their tactics. You know, they didn't think there was any one way to do it, but it was trying to draw on lots of different strategies and put them together. Okay. So in conclusion, the duality of praxis and consciousness that became so apparent in my research, I believe can provide a model for dialogue. And it has been applied both in and outside of research. And importantly, it's something that continues to move and evolve in my life. So, you know, for example, I've applied this model to youth work, both in terms of theory and practice, but also other educational opportunities, such as school-based peace work. So, for example, in the second largest city in the UK, I facilitated 4 dialogue groups in 3 schools, reviewed provision, delivered training, and mentored practice in 15 other schools. So, you know, when we talk about, we focused a lot on personal change at the moment, but that's some evidence of how we can start moving towards structural change as well and impacting systems and institutions around us. And all of this stuff is rooted in dialogue. So I just want to reiterate this idea that, you know, I think dialogue is a strong way to challenge violence and advance peace and social justice. And you know, these are the models fundamentally that I use. So you can see the process that's been taken from our understanding of dialogue that we looked at earlier on and PAR, and it just becomes these circles of reflection and inquiry. So if nothing else, I'd ask that you find ways to open spaces for dialogue and reflection in your practice. This is a lot, and I'm not going to go into this in any great depth, but when we're talking about the duality of praxis and consciousness, we need to be aware of our own positionality, right? And I've spoken about this a little bit with both groups. So, you know, for me, I'm really clear that I study peace as something distinct, primary, and independent, right? So I'm pro-peace, and I see the language of peace as being something that counters how our social reality is constructed at the moment. I'm interested in disrupting trends and assumptions that in some way knowing violence and conflict is a way to knowing peace. I think, you know, supporting the point that you've just mentioned, for me, the more we study violence, the more we're going to know about violence. I'm interested in strengthening associations between young people and peace, rather than young people, peace, and young people and violence. Prioritizing a youth lens. So this is something that I did with young people. Next, I'm interested in our YPAR project, which is where we can mentor young people to go out and do photo voice and do PAR. So it's not even a case of providing platforms for young people to share their voices and amplify their voices. It's an opportunity for young people to design research from the ground up. Is that something that you feel talks to? Yeah, good. And I'm interested in this thing, distinguishing between the motives that drive people to want to end violence and conflict and the motives that drive people to want to work to promote peace. I'm not going to get into all the theory about negative and positive peace at the moment, but there's something different about just wanting to come away from violence and the threat of violence to actually being committed to investing in peace, whatever that means for you and your community and social justice. And I'm interested in offering a more complete understanding of peace. I hope that just having this opportunity today to just dig into this concept of peace from a slightly different angle has helped you to, you know, have a little bit more of a complicated notion of what peace might mean in your life. And then we haven't, well, it's up to you guys. I mean, we're moving towards 12:30, but some questions maybe for you to take away. Yeah? How do I understand peace in the everyday life of young people? How do I create opportunities to discover and discuss young people's lived experience of peace? Yeah. So again, that's not how do I discuss how young people understand how I understand peace. It's how do I discuss young people's lived experiences of peace? How do I showcase the viewpoint of young people and encourage young people's concerns, aspirations, and active solutions for peace in their communities? And then going into more of a structural lens, how do I build involvement and responsibility in my organization or my business or my agency to strengthen young people's peace and young people's participation for peace? And I'm hoping that those questions help you to start finding your own positionality. Thank you.